Then Ms. Hildebrandt, how do you plead to count 1, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony? And to count 3, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony? To count 5, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony? And to count 6, also aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Jodi Hildebrandt's defense attorney, Douglas Terry, spoke to local media reporters outside a Utah courthouse following her guilty plea. He did say that one of the primary reasons Jodi Hildebrandt decided to plead guilty even before Ruby Franke did was because she did not want the children to have to testify against her. Is this a sign of remorse? Could she really have the well-being of the Franke children at heart? Join us as we dive back into the Ruby Franke case to uncover the possibility of the kids testifying in court and what that would have meant for their healing. December 27th, while most of us were still enjoying the festivities, Jodi Hildebrandt was pretty busy entering a guilty plea in court.
How do you plead to count 1, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony? And to count 3, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony? To count 5, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony? And to count 6, also aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony? The court finds that there is a sufficient factual basis. The court, in addition, finds that Ms. Hildebrandt's pleas are made knowingly and voluntarily. The court therefore accepts and enters those pleas, dismisses the remaining 2 counts.
Afterwards, her attorney, Douglas Terry, had a couple of things to say to the public with regard to the child abuse case. And the first thing he emphasized was that Jodi Hildebrandt pled guilty to only 4 of the original 6 charges in the same manner that Ruby Franke did.
Ms. Hildebrandt, my client, has pled guilty today to 4 counts. She has done so because she takes responsibility for her conduct in this matter.
He then emphasized that Jodi had entered the guilty plea solely because she took responsibility for her actions. In doing so, he also hinted that Jodi had made that decision even before Ruby Franke entered into a plea agreement with the state.
Plead guilty before Ms. Franke entered into her plea agreement or agreed to cooperate with the state.
Now, this was when things got interesting. The attorney also mentioned that Jodi did not want the children to have to testify to anything in hopes that they could finally get the much-needed emotional and physical healing they deserve.
She has pled guilty because she did not want these children to have to testify. She takes responsibility. And it is her main concern at this point that these children can heal, both physically and emotionally. We look forward to sentencing. That's all I have to say.
With all this talk of emotional and physical healing that the youngest Franke children actually need, let us take a quick look at all the Franke children endured in the Hildebrandt House of Horrors. Now, for the first time since the arrest, we finally got graphic details of the crimes Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt committed against the children. And this information was obtained from Ruby Franke's plea agreement documents. First, let's talk about the first count of child abuse that Ruby Franke pled guilty to, which is aggravated child abuse of RF, being Russell Franke. This particular charge is about the physical injury and physical torture that Russell Franke endured. The document said, quote, "The defendant's actions involved the physical torture of RF. Initially, RF was forced to do physical tasks for hours and days at a time. These included wall sites, carrying boxes full of books up and down stairs, and working outside. Eventually, RF was forced to do outside labor without shoes and in the summer heat. He was forced to stand in the direct sunlight for several days. He was forced to remain outside at all hours of the day and night, and for extended periods of time. These actions resulted in repeated and serious sunburns with blisters and sloughing skin. RF was denied adequate water for several of the days he was required to remain in the summer heat, and he was punished when he secretly consumed water. He was denied sufficient food, and when given food, he was given very plain meals, for example, rice and chicken, while others in the house ate regular and more flavorful meals. He was isolated from other people and denied all forms of entertainment, including books, notebooks, and electronics. In addition, after RF attempted to run away in July, his hands and feet were regularly bound. Binding included being tied to the defendant and weights. Many times, the binding included using 2 sets of handcuffs, one on RF's wrists and one on his ankles. At times, with RF lying on his stomach, ropes were used to tie the 2 sets of handcuffs together so that his arms and lower legs were lifted off the ground. The bindings resulted in injuries to RF's wrists and ankles, where the handcuffs cut through the skin and damaged the muscle tissue. These injuries were treated with homeopathic remedies and covered with duct tape. Then the bindings were placed on top of the duct tape. Specific instances of abuse committed by the defendant include 1. Kicking RF while wearing boots. 2. Holding his head underwater. And 3. Cutting off oxygen by placing her hands over his mouth and nose. At this point, we had to stop and think about the earlier moments in this case. All that time, we have been hearing about duct tape, cayenne peppers, and all the other bad stuff, but we never imagined that the abuse was this bad. When you recall the facts, you will realize that this abuse occurred over a 3-month period over the summer, from around May to August. So, just think about how hot it was out in those months when Russell was made to stay outside. Ruby Franke also pleaded guilty to count 3 in the original charging document. This 3rd count is about aggravated child abuse. On this note, the document read, "The actions described above cause severe emotional harm to RF due to the fact that they began in May and escalated throughout the summer months." Additionally, the defendant and another adult regularly sought to indoctrinate RF and convince him that he was evil and possessed, and that he needed to willingly be obedient to avoid punishment, and that the punishments were necessary to repent. He was also told that everything that was being done to him were acts of love. Hearing this, we immediately begin to think about everything Jodi Hildebrandt said about their aunt, Jodi Hildebrandt. This is definitely the kind of manipulation that Jesse allegedly endured at Jodi's hand. Jodi Hildebrandt, who prefers the pronouns they/them, is a child of one of Jodi's siblings. Unfortunately, their parents had put them in Jodi's care when they were young.
We knew 14, almost 15 years ago that she's already done this to me.
The harsh treatment Jesse endured greatly mirrors all that the younger Franke children seemingly endured in that house of horrors.
This room and write out my sins on a paper. She would come back in and read these sins back to me and have me kneel on the floor on my hands and knees and beg for forgiveness.
According to Jesse, Jodi Hildebrandt has a long history of child abuse, including the use of duct tape.
So the things that I experienced while living with Jodi, I experienced being tied, I experienced being duct taped, I experienced being blindfolded, I experienced severe isolation, I experienced severe emotional, spiritual, and psychological abuse. I experienced the being told I shouldn't be around other people, being told that I was dangerous to be around. People were afraid of me to the point where I was afraid of myself. Remarkably convincing. She is also terrifying if you cross her, because she has and will systematically destroy your life. She destroys your reputation. She destroys any of your credibility. Because 1, we have a culture of people not believing children and not trusting children. And also children trust their parents, and then the parents trust the church. So there's been, and Jodi, what she does that's so tricky is that she utilizes and uses whatever is available. So if you go to her with OCD, if you go to her with severe depression, she'll use that information as a way of control. Oh, you have OCD because you have deep-rooted shame. And those tics are happening because the shame has nowhere to go. And so it's coming out in this neuroticism. It's devastating because I went forward as well. I mean, I went to the police when I was 16. I tried to do what I could, and no one believed me. Because why would they? She destroyed my credibility. I was an angry teenager. And I'm coming forward. I was not planning on coming forward to the media other than just doing the podcast interview. Is when I heard that Ruby accused her child of this, and I just hope that this can give the public some context and some clarity of what is happening and why they should not believe her.
So 6 charges of
Now that's just 2 counts. Let's go back to the plea agreement documents. According to the documents, Ruby also pled guilty to count 5 in the original charging document. This count 5 is about the abuse of EF being Eve Franke, who was only 9 years old at the time. According to the documents, the defendant's actions also caused severe emotional harm to EF. Other than binding in the specific instances of abuse RF was subjected to, EF was subjected to the same treatment as her brother. She was isolated and forced to do the physical tasks, remained outside and denied food and water. She was also repeatedly told she was evil and possessed. The punishments were necessary for her to be obedient and to repent, and these things were being done to her in order to help her. EF was convinced that she was evil and needed to go through these things in order to repent. Moving on to the last count that Ruby Franke pled guilty to, it was the 6th count in the original charging documents. Now, this was abuse that constituted physical injury that includes multiple injuries specifically directed at Eve Franke. The document read, "The defendant's actions caused 2 or more physical injuries to EF. She was forced to work outside in the heat, barefoot. She was also forced to run barefoot on dirt roads for an extended period of time. F's feet were repeatedly injured, and she was repeatedly sunburned. When examined on August 30, these wounds were apparent by scabs, blisters, and sloughing skin. These are very serious and even life-threatening situations that nobody, let alone children, should be subjected to. Not to mention the long-term effects that the experience leaves behind. Child abuse survivors can suffer from a range of psychological, emotional, and physical issues as a result of their traumatic experiences. And these range from anxiety disorders to PTSD. And this condition is unfortunately characterized by intrusive memories, flashbacks, nightmares, and heightened anxiety. Survivors may even experience emotional distress and have difficulty coping with triggering situations that remind them of their periods of abuse. Next up, depression and anxiety disorders. Child abuse survivors face a high risk of developing depression and a wide range of anxiety disorders, from generalized anxiety disorder to social anxiety disorder and even panic disorder. And as you can imagine, these conditions can significantly impact their daily functioning and overall well-being, even unto adulthood. Low self-esteem and self-worth. Child abuse can lead to feelings of shame, guilt, and inadequacy. Survivors may struggle with low self-esteem and have difficulty forming positive relationships. They may also have a negative self-image and struggle with self-acceptance. Now, this is just a general possibility that comes along with child abuse, let alone being constantly told that you were evil and possessed. It is heartbreaking to imagine that Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt conditioned the children to believe that the abusive treatment was coming from a place of love and concern for their well-being. That is traumatizing and would take a lot of work to heal from. In the initial arrest reports, one official documented that it took a considerable amount of time to get little Eve to go with the officials to get medical help. It is heartbreaking to think that Eve actually believed that something was wrong with her and that her mother, Ruby, and Aunt Jodi were punishing her to make her better. Then, of course, there is the possible abuse and addiction to substances. Many child abuse survivors eventually turn to substance abuse as a way to cope with the emotional pain and trauma they have experienced at such an early stage in life. This can lead to the development of substance use disorders and addictions. Sadly, this only worsens their mental health challenges, but they are none the wiser. All they seek in the moment would be a temporary release from the pain. Now, this one is pretty uncommon, but it is still a possibility. Depending on the nature of the abuse, survivors may develop eating disorders, such as anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, or binge eating disorder, as a way to gain control or cope with their traumatic experiences. Remember Ruby Franke occasionally denied her children food? If this happened long enough, it could form the basis for eating disorders that would eventually have severe physical and emotional consequences on the children. We believe you are familiar with dissociative disorders. Sadly, some child abuse survivors may develop dissociative identity disorders, multiple personality disorder, and dissociative amnesia. These disorders involve a disruption in consciousness, memory, identity, or perception of the self. We also can't forget the emotional toll that child abuse leaves on its victims. Perhaps most important of all is the difficulty that comes with forming and keeping relationships. Child abuse can impair a survivor's ability to form healthy, trusting relationships. They may even struggle with intimacy, have difficulty establishing boundaries, and may experience challenges in maintaining long-term relationships. Lastly, the physical health problems. Child abuse survivors may experience various physical health problems depending on the nature of the trauma they endured. These can include chronic pain, gastrointestinal issues, headaches, and other psychosomatic symptoms. While we placed emphasis on these effects of child abuse, it is important to note that not all survivors will experience the same issues. Individual experiences may vary, and some children will prove to be more resilient than others. It is not all grim news because there are ways to get help. From therapy to joining support groups, there is hope for victims of child abuse to cope with and heal from these challenges. So what if the Franke children want to testify and be healed? First off, let us analyze what the experts determine the children would likely experience. It is expected that they will feel anxious, scared, and overwhelmed when the time comes to testify against their abuser in court. This seems like a harsh condition to subject the Franke children to, and it is probably why the state is always willing not to take such cases to trial in the first place. However, experts believe that sharing your truth can be a crucial step in your healing process. If they did have to testify, we believe that they would not have taken on such a difficult time alone. They will have the opportunity to seek help from an attorney and will be able to rely on their family for support. Now, to actually get ready to testify, experts recommend a couple of tips that would be helpful to children who have to testify against their abuser. The first step would be writing down a detailed account of the events as the victim remembers it. These details would include dates, what happened, and the circumstances leading up to the incident. This exercise is not about memorizing their testimony, but rather refreshing their memory to be better prepared for whatever questions come up in court. During testimony, victims will take an oath to tell the truth. First, the victim's attorney will then ask them questions about the events. And after that, the abuser's attorney will come up to cross-examine them. And this is done with every intention to challenge their credibility and create some form of reasonable doubt. This is a typical part of the trial process, and it will be the hardest for any abuse survivor, let alone a child. But if a child must go through this, they would be made to understand that the most important thing is to tell the truth. And when a question that they can't answer comes up, they should know that "I don't remember" is a very acceptable response in court. An attorney for Washington County, Eric Clark, also made a couple of statements to the local media that afternoon. He informed the public that Jodi Hildebrandt will remain incarcerated while awaiting her sentencing, which has been set for February 23, 2024. He went over a couple of other things regarding the case, but the most notable was the fact that the state is pretty satisfied with the outcome of the Franke and Hildebrandt case so far. He explained how extremely hard it is to ask victims of alleged abuse to testify during a trial against their abusers, even more so kids in this particular case. All things considered, taking off 2 counts from the defendant's charges is apparently a small price to pay. It is now certain that both defendants will be going to prison without having to hold a trial.
And we're not afraid of trials. We don't want to avoid trials. Trials carry some risk in that you don't know what the outcome's going to be. But more so when you have victims that are having to go through the trial process, that's difficult. Difference in reality between 4 counts and 6 counts, in our calculation, wasn't enough to justify asking victims to.
In Utah, the maximum penalty for second-degree crimes is 30 years, so whether it is 4 counts or 6, the state is satisfied that both Ruby Franke and her partner, Jodi Hildebrandt, will be going away for a really long time.